Good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And let me dig this out here real quick. I thought I had it laying out already, and I don't. So here we go. Okay, so this is video number 11, responding to some objections to my brand new book, Temple to Telos. Now, the thrust of the book is Hebrews chapter 9, Matthew 5, Luke 21:22, Revelation 10, etc., etc. As they all say, or I should say, as they all teach, all prophecy would be fulfilled by the time of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, that means that the Old Covenant temple and its cultus would stand valid until that destruction. Well, several objections have been lodged about that. You know, some people have really put a tremendous amount of focus on the fact that the temple actually fell the 9th of Av, some say 10th, but anyway, of Av, and that the Feast of Tabernacles would not have been fulfilled for another 30 days or so. And so they say, see, temple fell, but the time for the feast days was still 30 to 40 days off. Therefore, Preston is wrong. Well, as I have explained several different times, we are told by Jesus himself, in talking about the days of vengeance, which is the time of Rosh Hashanah, except those days be shortened. Now, what's interesting to me is about the only answer to that argument that I've received so far is ridicule. But let me remind you, ridicule is not refutation. So, as I've pointed out before, unless you can prove that in Jesus' discussion of the days of vengeance, that those days of vengeance had nothing to do whatsoever with the fulfillment of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Teruah, however whichever term you want to use, then we must at least consider Jesus' words as having some kind of an impact on it. Now, over the last two videos, I've shared with you the importance and the significance of considering Luke chapter 21 and verse 22. Because you see, these be the days of vengeance, Jesus said, referring to the time of the fall of Jerusalem and the temple. These be the days of vengeance in which all things that are written must be fulfilled. So here's what that means. If you are going to extrapolate the fulfillment of prophecy beyond the time of the judgment of Jerusalem and the temple, then you have to be able to explain why Jesus said, these be the days of vengeance in which all things that are written must be fulfilled. Been interesting to me how few comments, how few objections to that have been offered. But it's got to be dealt with, ladies and gentlemen. Wasn't the fact that Tishri came such a short period of time after Av, is that not involved in the time of the vengeance? Is it not involved in the time of the casting down of the temple, the city? How do you just take Jehoiakim's penknife, as it were, and just completely divorce Tishri from the events of Av? Well, as I've suggested before, to me that strikes me as Argumentum ad Desperatum, trying to find some argument, any argument, to lodge against my book. And I say with all due respect, it just simply doesn't work. Now, one individual posted repeatedly, and actually more than one individual, there have been at least two or three individuals who have posted that my entire argument is based upon a misunderstanding of Matthew chapter 5, 17 and 18. Now, I have to say this. one of those individuals has said that over and over and over again, that my premises, that my dependence on Matthew 5, 17 and 18 is false. So when I've challenged this individual, okay, bring forth your strong reasons as to why my argument on Matthew chapter 5, 17 and 18 is invalid. If you're going to say my argument on Matthew 5, 17 and 18 is invalid, therefore my argument in the book is invalid, then don't you have an obligation to lay out your argument against my argument? Instead of saying, well, Preston, I've told you before, your view on Matthew 5, 17 and 18 is false. Well, prove it. Now, another individual posted, and he did this a couple of different times, posted, once again, that my argument on Matthew chapter 5, 17 and 18 is absolutely foundational to not only my argument in the book, but to my full preterism. This individual claims to have been a full preterist at one time. And so, over the next few videos, I want to address some arguments that he put forth. Now, before I proceed, and he listed 7 points of supposed refutation of my position on Matthew 5, 17 and 18. The very first objection is, point number 1, you, that's me, you need to prove that the word all is used in the absolute sense when it seldom is elsewhere in Scripture. And so this individual is arguing, okay, yes, Jesus said, not one jot or one tittle shall pass from the law until it is all fulfilled. But you see, Preston, the word all is very commonly not comprehensive. Well, nobody doubts that. Nobody denies that. So this individual offers Joshua chapter 21, 43 to 45, in which the Lord, speaking of the land promises that were made to Israel. You see, what I'm saying here is the text itself delimits the definition of all, in which God said all of the promises of the good things that God had made to Israel, all were fulfilled. God gave them all of the land. Okay, so all there doesn't refer to the messianic prophecies of the coming of Christ. It certainly does not include the second coming of Christ. No one would argue that it does. What I argue is that the text itself defines what is meant by all. And it involves 2 things. The reception of all of the land, which was incumbent upon the destruction of their enemies, therefore God giving them rest from all of their enemies. And so, what this individual has to prove is that the delimited all in Joshua 21, 43 to 45 controls Matthew 5, 17 and 18. But here's the question. Where, and I've posed this repeatedly in my responses on YouTube under my videos, when objection has been raised about, oh, well, all doesn't always mean all. Well, again, no one argues that all invariably means all. No one argues that all always, pun, always means all. So this is a diversionary argument. The question is, whereas all in Joshua, and he listed a couple of other verses which have the same kind of delimitation in the text, but my question to him was, where in Matthew 5, 17 and 18 do we find a delimitation of all? Where do we find Jesus saying everything that is written in the Decalogue must be fulfilled? Where do we find in the text of Matthew chapter 5, 17 and 18, Not one jot or one tittle shall pass from the law until the Pentateuch is fulfilled. Not there, and you know it's not there. And so as I wrote in response, I said this. Jesus said not one jot or one tittle would pass until it was all fulfilled. Now let me ask you a question. Was the totality of the law, was all of the law comprised of jots and tittles? Well, you know, it's dotting of I, crossing of T. The all in Matthew chapter 5, as I continued, that all is inclusive of every jot and every tittle. Not one jot, not one tittle shall pass until it is all. All what? Jots and tittles. So you see, Jesus is very, very careful in the text to tell us what all means. It means every jot, every tittle. Now, not only that, ladies and gentlemen, it's very often argued. This individual didn't make this specific argument. He was simply trying to imply that. He never explicitly said it, but he was trying to imply it. What you see, what his argument is, well, the word all doesn't always mean all. Therefore, in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus wasn't saying that every jot and every tittle of the law, he wasn't saying all of the law had to be fulfilled, just part of it. Now, he refused to explicitly say that, and that's revealing. Here's one of the things that I responded by noting. Okay, you're going to argue that Joshua chapter 21, 43 to 45, all does not mean all. Okay, that's fine. Well, in Romans 3:23, Paul said, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. So, based upon that logic that's being argued from Joshua chapter 21, since all doesn't mean all there, then all doesn't mean all in Romans 3:23. So all haven't sinned after all. He never responded to that directly. He couldn't. You see, this individual, as well as the others who objected to my appeal to Matthew chapter 5, 17 and 18, they know, they understand very well that there are passages in the New Testament, there are passages in the Bible in which the word all means exactly what it means. All. But they understand very, very well. They understand that if Matthew 5, 17 and 18, is allowed to mean all, then their futurism is destroyed. Why is that? Well, some of them try to argue, well, look, you have the law, and then you have the prophets. Then you have the Psalms. Then you have the historical books. So therefore, when Jesus uses the term the law, he's not referring to the prophetic books, and he's not saying all of the prophecies of the Old Testament have to be fulfilled for the law to pass away. He's delineating between prophets and the law. Well, here's the problem with that. In Luke chapter 16 and verse 16, Jesus said, the law and the prophets prophesied until John. Excuse me, Lord, what was that you said? The law prophesied. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is devastating. This is absolutely devastating to the view that the law is distinct from the prophets in Matthew chapter 5. Once again, where is the delineation? Where is the distinction made in the text and in the context of Matthew chapter 5. Hey, I've asked this question over and over and over again, and no one has even attempted to answer it. But back to the point. The law and the prophets prophesied. So the argument is made, well, you have the law and then you have the prophets. Well, it overlooks and ignores the fact the law prophesied. How did the law prophesy? It prophesied through the feast days. Leviticus chapter 23. Now remember, Paul said that the law, the feast days, the new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths of Colossians chapter 2, 16 and 17, was still, when he wrote in AD 62, shadows of the good things that are about to come. They hadn't come yet. They had not been fulfilled yet. So since the new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths, which was a reference to the final three feast days, since those laws were shadows, types of the good things that were about to come, and when would the things of the law, of the feast days, the final three feast days, when would those good things actually come? Oh, in fulfillment of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets, which foreshadowed the judgment. So until the feast day that foreshadowed the coming of the final judgment was fulfilled, the law was not fulfilled. Yom Kippur. Hebrews chapter 9 makes it abundantly clear that Jesus had begun the process of fulfilling Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, through his coming at the end of the ages to offer himself as a sacrifice, entering into the most holy place, and that he was about to come to bring salvation in completion of Yom Kippur. So until the second appearing of Christ, there could be no salvation, and Yom Kippur was not fulfilled, meaning the law was not fulfilled. Leviticus 16, which is all about Yom Kippur, not fulfilled. Leviticus 23, which is about all of the feast days, not fulfilled. And the same with Sukkot. Sukkot was the Feast of Ingathering, the Feast of Harvest, which represented the time in which God would dwell with man. This is Revelation 21, 1-3. That at the time of the end, the time of the parousia of Christ, John said, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. And I saw a new Jerusalem coming down from God out of heaven. And a voice saying, the tabernacle of God is with man. Here's the ultimate fulfillment of Sukkot, ladies and gentlemen. And it wouldn't come until after the millennium, after the judgment, after. Maybe we could say even at the time of the fulfillment of Yom Kippur. Point being, the law prophesied. And so when attempts are made to say, well, in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is talking about the law, but he's not talking about the prophets. Point number one, where is the delineation in Matthew chapter 5? Where? I can't get anyone to show me, or even to try to show me, the delineation between the law and the prophets, or between the law and the Psalms. And by the way, folks, in my book, Temple to Telos, I point out that in the Bible, the law, the Decalogue, and the Pentateuch is called the law. Not just the Decalogue, but the entirety of the Pentateuch. The first 5 books of the Bible. Not only that, point number 2, the prophetic books are called the law. Okay, so if the prophetic books are called the law, then when Jesus said, Not one jot or one tittle shall pass from the law. The law. Not one jot or one tittle shall pass from the law until it is all fulfilled. So how do you exclude the prophetic books which are called the law? And remember again, the law and the prophets prophesied. There's no division. There's no dichotomy. There is no distinction. So you have no authority, no justification, no context for saying, in Matthew 5, Jesus is talking about, perhaps the Pentateuch, but not Isaiah, which is specifically called the law by Paul in 1 Corinthians 14, 20 and 21. And then the Psalms, and this is remarkable, in Romans chapter 3, starting with about verse 18 and 19, Paul quotes the Psalms and Proverbs over and over and over again, and he says, now we know that whatsoever things the law says, we know that whatever the law says, what are you talking about, Paul? The law. But you just quoted from Psalms and Proverbs. Yeah, that's right, because the law was the Psalms and Proverbs. And the Psalms and Proverbs are being called by the divinely inspired apostle the law. So, once again, since Paul called the Psalms the law, where in Matthew 5 do we find a delineation between the law and the Psalms? Where do we find Jesus saying, now, when I'm talking about the law here, folks, I am not talking about the Psalms, and I'm not talking about the prophetic books. I'm only talking about, I can't even be talking about the Pentateuch, actually, because the Pentateuch contains an awful lot of prophetic material. I'm only talking about the Decalogue. Oh, wait a minute. That doesn't work because the Sabbath, the fourth commandment, was prophetic, of ultimate salvation, resurrection. You see how futile this objection truly is? And then this individual actually made the comment. Look, you just got to catch the power of this. This individual said, animal sacrifices and fleshly circumcision are no longer valid. Wait a minute. Okay. Animal sacrifices and physical circumcision were part of the law. Numbers 28, Leviticus 23, Genesis chapter 17, Genesis chapter 12. Circumcision, part of the law. So here's an individual who wants to find some way to delineate between the law and say, it didn't all have to be fulfilled for it to pass away. But he turns right around and says, you know what? A whole bunch of the law, the temple cultus, the priesthood, the entire sacrificial system, and circumcision. It's all been done away with. Well, then that means that part of the jots and the tittles were fulfilled and passed away. So where does that leave you? That leaves you with the Decalogue. But wait a minute, that's not going to work. Because remember, the Decalogue contained the law of the Sabbath, which foretold resurrection rest. and it had to be fulfilled before any of the law. Jesus did not say, ladies and gentlemen, in any way whatsoever that there was a qualification of the definition of the law in Matthew chapter 5. So when you, as an objector to the text of Matthew chapter 5, when you say, well, Jesus did not mean the law comprehensively, the burden of proof is on you, not on me. I'm taking the text as it says. Now, by the way, let me remind everyone that when we approach any text, a primary rule of hermeneutic is that a word, term, or phrase must be given its normal definition unless and until context does not allow that. That's just a primary rule of hermeneutic. Okay, so when we come to Matthew chapter 5, what's the normal definition of all? Well, the normal definition of all doesn't mean part, a little bit, some. It means, well, all. And to compound that definition, we have Jesus' statement that the all is comprised of every jot and every tittle. Not every jot and every tittle of some of it, but every jot and every tittle of all of it. The burden of proof is on the objectors to the normal use of all and the definition by Jesus himself of every jot and every tittle, or not one jot and not one tittle. So I say this as humbly and as respectfully as I possibly can. When you try to redefine all, when you try to redefine jots and tittles, then the burden of proof is squarely on you. I'm accepting it for what it says. I'm following the basic rule of hermeneutic. And when you tell me, well, yeah, animal sacrifices and physical circumcision, that's been done away with. Well, that means that at least the Decalogue, the Pentateuch, has been taken out of the way. Okay? Where does that leave you? What does that leave you? Oh, back to the Decalogue and the Sabbath, which is prophetic and had to be fulfilled until, or for it to be invalidated. The legalistic seventh-day observance. See, I'm a firm believer that you and I today, I'm a firm believer that Christians now celebrate the eighth day. Shemonai Atzerat, the new creation, salvation in Christ, with Sukkot having been fulfilled. So that's objection number one that this individual lodged against Matthew chapter 5, 17 and 18. Now, before moving on to the rest of his objections, I will simply point this out. After several back and forths that he and I had on the definition of the word all, he finally conceded that all in Matthew 5, 17 and 18 means all. Well, you cannot concede that all in Matthew 5, 17 and 18 refers to the entirety of the law without becoming a full preterist, because the law consisted of the Decalogue, the Pentateuch, the prophets, and the Psalms. Every single jot and every single tittle. When you concede all means all, then all of that is fulfilled. And you come back and say, well, that's not what I meant. but that's what it demands. Okay, I'm out of time. Thanks for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. I'll see you on the flip side as we continue our examination of Steve Gregg's book, Why Not Full Preterism. I'll see you there.